All right, everyone. Well, I know this is a little bit unusual with not many people from Coffee Hour having come in yet, but the last service ran quite late. I don't know. I wasn't there, so was Father Edward's sermon just really long, or lots of music, or I'm not sure what it was. But in any case, a lot of people are still in Coffee Hour, but I don't want to waste our speaker's time today, so. Or I don't want to short shrift him in terms of time. So let's get started. And as people come in, hopefully they'll come in as I'm introducing him, and we can close the doors and begin. Today we are honored to be joined by the Reverend Dr. David Marshall, who is joining us from Bern, Switzerland. David is a priest in the Church of England who should be no stranger here at Trinity. He has been kind enough to speak to us on a variety of topics over the years. You probably remember he's given talks on Christian-Muslim relations. He's talked about sort of English, some Anglican spiritual writers. This Lent, David has planned a very special series for us. And rather than steal his thunder, I'll let him introduce it. So David, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. It's great to be with you. Thank you for the introduction. Good to be with you all at Trinity-by-the-Cove again. I'm very excited about this series of 4 talks that I'm going to give you and the conversations which I hope we'll have. It's a bit of a new thing for me to do. I've done bits and pieces on some of the writers I'm going to touch on, but not in the sort of systematic way that I'm doing on this occasion. I don't normally teach on literature, so it's a bit of an experiment for me. I hope you enjoy it. I'm looking forward to it. You should have 3 handouts. One is a brief introduction to the series of 4 sessions. One is a handout on Hilda Prescott and her book, The Man on a Donkey, which we're going to discuss today. And then a handout with a passage from the book, which I plan for us to read at the end of the session. So, just a few introductory remarks about the course as a whole. It's a bit of an eccentric selection of 3 authors that we're going to be looking at. In the first week, so first Sunday today and in 3 weeks' time, we'll be looking at Hilda Prescott. I'll say quite a bit about her in a moment. And then in weeks 2 and 3, each time we will look at a priest poet. One, a very famous one from the 17th century, George Herbert. And then in the 3rd week, a living priest poet, Malcolm Guite. Perhaps some of you have come across his poems, which are starting to be quite well known in Christian circles, not least in the US, where I know he's spoken at many churches. But I'm not mainly going to say a great deal about the authors. The aim is not to be, not just to talk about the people, but to look at their writings. This time, that won't be so much the case, but certainly with the 2 poets, what I'll aim to do is to create a handout with some poems. I'll introduce the 2 authors, and then we will read some of the poems. And just to flag up that I will leave a bit of time for you to reflect on them. We won't just rush madly from one thing to the next. This is Lent, and although I hope you find it interesting and enjoyable in literary terms, aesthetic terms, I hope you enjoy the literature we read. I do want it also to be a spiritually enriching experience for Lent. So I'll leave some time for reflection, hopefully also some time for question and discussion at the end. I don't assume any prior knowledge of the authors. One, George Herbert is very well known. Some of you may know his work very well. The other 2, Hilda Prescott, not very well known. I would call her one of the hidden gems of English literature. Malcolm Guite is starting to be well known in some circles, but so it's an odd selection, but it reflects my enthusiasms and some things I'd like to share with you. My main aim, frankly, is to encourage you to read these authors. Some of them, particularly Herbert, may be old friends to some of you, but others probably not. And if any of you go away and read some of the authors I talk about, then I will feel that I've succeeded. There's no need for you to read ahead. I have mentioned, I think, in the publicity that I sent to Father Nicholas earlier, that if you have time in the coming 3 weeks and would be interested in reading Hilda Prescott's novel, The Man on a Donkey, I'm very much hoping you would. And that's why we're putting one session introducing the book today, and then another section where we will read a representative selection of passages from it in 3 weeks' time. It's quite a long book, and I realize that many of you may not have time to read this book in that time, but even if you just get to read a bit of it and get to start thinking about it and experiencing it, then that would work very well for a conversation in 3 weeks' time when we can talk about what we've discovered. Even if you haven't done that, I hope you'll return, because we will read some passages, and as I hope you'll see from the example I give today, she writes beautifully. It's very rich writing. So that's a brief account of where we're going over the coming today and the following 3 Sundays. Should I just press straight on? Nicholas, that good? Yep, right. So if you'd like to turn, well, if you want to follow what I'm saying, there's a handout with a photograph, little black and white photograph of Hilda Prescott. I'm going to say a bit about her life and works, a little bit about the historical background to the book in the 16th century England, and then something about the book and how it works before we read one section before closing. Hilda Prescott, who lived from 1896 to 1972. Difficult to find out much about her. I only just managed to find this one photograph. Finally, I tracked down some information about her in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. A sense to me of somebody rather self-effacing, somebody not as it were, looking for the limelight. She was born in Cheshire in the north of England. Her father was an Anglican priest who died when she was just over a year old. She and her brother were brought up by her mother, who had been an elementary school teacher. She studied history at Oxford University and then went on to do historical research at Manchester University. She taught at private schools and also some teaching at Oxford. Later, she became vice principal of a college at the University of Durham. So she had an academic university career at a time when this was still fairly unusual for a woman. A friend described her as a brilliant and successful lecturer and teacher, but with a strain of wildness and individuality in her in spite of her self-discipline. She wrote books of various kinds, including a murder mystery, a number of historical novels set in medieval France, a translation of a medieval French text, historical studies, notably a biography of Mary Tudor, who features as a young princess in this novel that we're looking at today. She is most known for The Man on a Donkey, which was published in 1952, which has been described as the war and peace of the English Reformation. It's frankly not that well known. I have a copy here in Penguin, so I mean she did quite well to get it into publication with Penguin eventually, but not so well known. I came across it, I think it's worth telling the story, through Archbishop Rowan Williams. At the time I was serving on the staff of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. One of my jobs as one of his members of staff was to answer letters, endless letters, and one type of letter that the Archbishop got, we called in our office favourites. People doing projects in schools would write to famous people and say, what's your favourite book? What's your favourite ice cream flavour? I'm not joking. They were all kinds of things. So when he arrived in office, I was there when he arrived in office, we sent him a list of things and said, please could you tell us what your favourite of the following things are, so that we can answer these letters on your behalf and send your warm greetings and blessings, and you don't have to answer these letters, because your job would be impossible if you had to. So in answer to the question, what's your favourite book? He actually said, well, I can't narrow it down to one. He listed about 5, and I can remember 2. One is Dickens's novel Bleak House, but another was Prescott's The Man on a Donkey. I had never heard of this book. I stumbled across it in this edition in a second-hand bookshop a few weeks later, and I read it, and it's a wonderful book. And it had people who've read it. I haven't come across anybody who doesn't love it. I've shared my enthusiasm about it with a few people, including with some students here recently, and people find it very moving, very powerful. So that's the background as to how I came across it. I wonder if any of you read it before, or have any of you been prompted to order a copy? Could you show a hand if anybody? Right? Whoa! Oh, I've got some hands going up. Well, I'm quite happy to proceed on whatever basis. I just hope that I'll engender some enthusiasm for the book in some of you in due course. Prescott was one of a number of Christian scholars and writers of her era, something of a golden age, I would say, of Christian scholarship, Christian writing in England, many of whom were specialists in medieval or earlier literature. Two big names that come to mind are, of course, Tolkien and Lewis, but there are also a number of women writers, again, more or less exact contemporaries with her, such as Dorothy L. Sayers, who, like her, also wrote murder mysteries, rather more successful than Hilda Prescott's murder mystery. Helen Waddell. Some of you may know the work of Sigrid Undset. Has anyone read Kristin Lavransdatter? Yeah, now, it's very interesting. Kristin Lavransdatter is much better known in the USA than in America. I encountered that book when I was working in at Duke in North Carolina. I would say that The Man on a Donkey, put it this way, I think Kristin Lavransdatter is the nearest equivalent I can think of. An epic historical novel set in the medieval period, but with profound spiritual insights and themes running through it. Something about the historical background, and I'll pause when I get to the end of this historical background because I'm going to pack a lot in. I'm not an expert I'm not a historian primarily, but I'm fascinated by this period. Some of you may know it better than I do, but I just want to give you, if you do read it, helpful to have this background sketch just to kind of orientate yourself to what's going on. The story takes place in the reign of Henry VIII, who was king from 1509 to 1547, a period of immense political and religious upheaval in England. When he comes to the throne as a young man in 1509, he is a devout Roman Catholic. The Church in England is a loyal part of the wider Roman Catholic Church under the authority of the Pope. Only 25 years later, in 1534, Henry pushed through Parliament the Act of Supremacy, which rejects the authority of the Pope and the Catholic Church in England and establishes the monarch, so himself, Henry, as the supreme head or governor of the Church in England. A very radical change. What caused it? Well, it was not because Henry had become a convinced Protestant. Certainly, during the first half of his reign, the ideas of Luther and other reformers began to spread in Europe and to penetrate England. New attitudes to the Bible and a desire to see it widely available in English were becoming popular in certain circles in England. But especially early on in his reign, Henry opposed these Protestant ideas fiercely, and Protestants were persecuted, sometimes executed. Henry did not break with Rome because he had become a convinced Protestant. It wasn't because of that. It was about authority in England. It was because he became persuaded that the King of England, not the Pope, should be the supreme governor of the Church in England. And caught up in this matter was a very personal issue for him. He wanted to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who had borne to Henry only one child who survived infancy, a daughter, Mary. Henry was desperate for a male heir. It seems Catherine won't bear him one. So he also became convinced he should never have married Catherine, who had previously been married briefly to his elder brother, who had died young, and there were discussions as to whether biblically and in terms of Christian canon law, moral law, whether that was right. Meanwhile, he had also fallen for a younger woman, Anne Boleyn. Anyway, he ends up, through his advisors like Wolsey and others, petitioning the Pope for the annulment of his marriage to Catherine. But for political as well as other reasons, the Pope would not grant it. That in the end prompts Henry and his advisors to reject the authority of the Pope over the Church in England. But the situation in England is very complex at this point, and we just, for understanding the book, it's very important to understand this, that when this Act of Supremacy is passed, although the Church in England had broken away from the authority in Rome, it's still basically Catholic in its beliefs and practices. It's a very confused sort of religious situation. Henry was never persuaded of Protestant doctrines, but the divorce and the break with Rome creates a situation that allows Protestantism to grow in England. So that, interestingly, the Archbishop he appoints, who's meant to help him get the divorce, Thomas Cranmer, the author of the Prayer Book, he is thoroughly Protestant, but is kind of biding his time while Henry is still alive, and plays his Protestant cards more fully after Henry's death, when he's able to take the Protestant Reformation further forward in England. So it's a very confused time. And the story in The Man on a Donkey reflects this confusing, traumatic period in the history of England. We hear in this story about the persecution of Protestants for their new beliefs, but also the persecution of devout Catholics who can't support King Henry's rejection of the authority of the Pope. And the most famous person in that category is Thomas More. But there's also, I think I'm right, my memory may fail me on this point, but some of the Carthusian monks in London, I believe they're another example of the persecution, in their case, the execution of Catholic opponents of Henry's break with Rome. The story focuses mainly on opposition from traditional Catholics like that to Henry's break with Rome. And an aspect of Henry's policy that is central to the story, it's mentioned from the first page onwards, is that, well, it's mentioned on the first page, and then it comes back into the history later on. The first page kind of happens at the end of the story, and then we go back to the beginning. This strand is the dissolution or suppression of the religious communities of England, monasteries and convents, and the seizure of their wealth for the use of the crown. This was implemented by Henry's chief advisor in the 1530s, Thomas Cromwell. It caused great ill feeling in many parts of the country that were still very attached to traditional Catholicism. And in 1536, an uprising occurred, starting in the Midlands and the north of England, which came to be known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. And this uprising and its aftermath are dwelt on at considerable length in the book and are really its climax. Any questions about where we've gone so far? Any historians among you want to shoot me down briefly? I don't have a lot of time, but any questions or comments on that, or shall I proceed? Looks like we're doing okay. You can always ask again at the end if you wanted, but just in case you were bursting to ask anything. Okay, I'll keep going. I can't see anybody waving a hand in. We're not primarily doing history, so that was just to kind of give you the basic framework for understanding what's going on. Earlier I mentioned a comparison of The Man on a Donkey with War and Peace. Tolstoy's massive novel, if you've read it, you will know it's often printed with a list at the end of all the main figures because it's so easy to get confused with who they all are. There's so many figures. You forget who is who and who's on which side. I think it's a bit like that with The Man on a Donkey, but sadly I don't think it is printed with a list of all the main characters and who they are and where they line up. I certainly found that from time to time I needed to Google who people were, or kind of whether they were historical figures or figures that Prescott had invented and so forth. But it's not essential to do that. If, like me, you get interested in the history, you will find it a rich experience, and you will probably do some exploring like that. You don't need to. The storyline is pretty clear, and anyway, the real achievement of the novel is not as a historical study. This is not a footnoted historical study. It is a work based on history, but fundamentally it's a work of extraordinary spiritual beauty and power. So let me turn now to the story itself. I'm going to avoid spoilers about the really key things, I think, in the drama. But so I'm not going to give the plot away, but I just want to give you a sense of how the book works, the key figures in it. So the events described take place over most of the reign of King Henry, from about 1507, just before his reign, to 1537. The book skims fairly briefly over the early years and focuses mainly towards the end of the period, with Henry's divorce from Catherine and his marriage to Anne Boleyn, the break with Rome, the closing of religious communities, and so on. The story moves between the big picture of major historical events and the lives of individuals at various levels of society. It's not all about kings and queens and Thomas Cromwell and so on. We have many historical figures, such as King Henry. We see quite a bit of him, his first three wives, his daughter Mary, Thomas Cromwell, other political figures, religious leaders, including Archbishop Cranmer. He's not a major figure, but he pops up from time to time. On Thomas Cromwell, I can't resist a brief aside. I expect some of you have read Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall or watched the BBC serialization. It's interesting. He's a fascinating figure, and I think there's a lot of interest in him today. An Anglican historian, Diarmaid MacCulloch, has written a very popular biography about him as well. But just to note, one of the things that's striking about Hilary Mantel's account, which is probably now the best known account there's ever been of Thomas Cromwell, I expect, is that she is very sympathetic to him. She tells the story through his eyes. Many other authors, including Hilary Prescott, give a much less attractive account of Cromwell. So that's quite an interesting question going on in the background there as well. At a lower level, in political terms than the kings and queens and archbishops of Canterbury and so on, figures of national significance like that, important roles are played in this story by other historical figures, among whom the two most important are Robert Aske, all these names are on the handout, who is a gentleman and a lawyer from Northern England, who stumbles into the role of leader of the Pilgrimage of Grace. And then another very important character is called Christabel Cooper, a very capable and forceful woman who becomes prioress of Marwick Priory in Yorkshire in the north of England. Much of the story focuses on her leadership and her attempts to safeguard the future of the priory against closure. The story's two main locations then are in London at the court, centre of political power, and then far away in the north, this priory and some of the surrounding towns and villages. And the book is described as a chronicle. It doesn't have chapters, but rather entries under successive dates. And most of the book is presented in that format, describing events on a particular day in a chronological sequence. But early on, Prescott departs from that structure to give introductions to 5 key characters. Let me just mention briefly who they are. I've already mentioned Christabel Cooper, the prioress. And there's Lord Darcy, who is an elderly, devout Catholic nobleman who is troubled by where things are going under King Henry. The Pilgrimage of Grace tests his loyalties. Will he support this Catholic uprising, or will he remain loyal to his king? Then there's Robert Aske, who I've already mentioned, who becomes leader of the Pilgrimage of Grace. Then there's a young woman called Julian Savage, a rather tragic figure who is in love with Aske, but unhappily for her, Aske is in love with her rather more beautiful elder sister. And finally, the fifth character, Gilbert Dorr. He's a capable youngish priest who is drawn toward Protestant beliefs, but he's embittered. He feels he's a failure, and he's often in despair about himself. So the story moves between these figures and others, many of them, as I said, historical figures, some of them invented. So it's an interweaving of history and imagination. Their lives are variously interwoven, and they have different attitudes to the Pilgrimage of Grace, and these differences reflect the complexities of human nature and of the political and religious alignments and conflicts of the time. But a key point in the structure and message of the book as a whole is that these 5 characters all at some point meet and talk to one extraordinary figure who really is in one sense at the very center of the book. And this is a poor servant woman called Mal, an uneducated, poor woman of uncertain origins who ends up living near the priory. She's a very marginal figure in the world's eyes. She's strange, she's physically unattractive, she's mocked and abused. The first time I read the book, I didn't grasp enough how central Mal is to Prescott's book. She's not at the center of the plot. She doesn't make anything happen, but she's at its spiritual center. So without giving too much away, let me urge you, if you read the book, to pay special attention to Mal. Undoubtedly, I mean, she must be a creation of Hilary Prescott, and into her, I think she pours a great deal of her spiritual insight. And Mal is really, I think, a key figure for Prescott. Note especially that all of the 5 characters that I mentioned above at some point talk to Mal, note those moments, and all basically ask her the same question. That's a key moment in the book. And Mal has visions of Christ. Most of the book is, in a sense, completely secular, describing political comings and goings, the business of politics, and so forth and so on. But there are moments of religious mystery, and we're going to be looking at one in a moment, sort of somehow woven into the fabric of the story. One of these visions is what gives the novel its title, because Mal sees Christ on a donkey in a nearby town. He is the man on a donkey. That scene isn't actually dwelt on at length. We're going to look at another scene of her seeing Christ, which is described in greater length. But Mal is the one who sees Christ and recognizes who he is. Most of the other characters are claiming, or at least trying in one way or another, to represent the cause of Christ. Some of them sincerely and bravely, others maybe more cynically or selfishly. But these powerful, capable, influential figures are all limited in what they can see of Christ. But Mal really sees Christ. She gets Christ. She expresses the meaning of Christ in words of beautiful, simple power. Finally, I must just mention one other figure. I'm nearly done, and then we're going to turn to the book itself. One other figure who died over a century before the Pilgrimage of Grace, but who is in the background of the story and is referenced at key moments. And this is Julian of Norwich. I believe my wife Helen has spoken about Julian of Norwich in sessions with Trinity-by-the-Cove in the past. She's not to be confused, by the way, with the young figure Julian Savage, who I mentioned, who is a figure actually in the book. Julian of Norwich is quoted twice near the middle of the book. I give the references in the handout, and at greater length on the last page, which is clearly an important summative moment, where we read 2 of her best-known phrases, "All shall be well," and "Love was his meaning." It's clear Prescott is pointing to Julian's message as a clue to the meaning of the whole book. I'll say more on that in 3 weeks. So, summarizing very briefly, why read this book? It's a big book. You may not have time to read it or all of it in the coming 3 weeks, but I hope I can prompt some of you to try it, whether now or later. I would encourage you to read it because it's a wonderful, complex, painful story on a wide canvas across different levels of society and with some memorable characters. We're drawn with great sympathy into the hearts and minds of very different characters, often with quite opposing convictions. It's a compelling story set in a fascinating historical period. It's beautifully written with particularly fine descriptions of English countryside, and it's a work of great Christian imagination and theological and spiritual depth. Now, I know we don't have a lot more time, but what I'd like to do now is to read one passage to you to give you a taste of the book. I think it'll take me maybe about 7 minutes or so, and then we'll keep a few minutes of silence, and I'll just invite you for maybe 4 minutes, if we've got that time, to reread the passage reflectively, asking yourself, what strikes you in it? What biblical resonances or other Christian resonances do you hear Are you left with any questions? So, I hope you've all got sight of this. If you haven't got sight of it, don't worry. But it's the entry for March the 28th, 1536. The setting is the Priory in the north of England, in Yorkshire. And among the characters we have in this scene the Prioress, Christabel Cooper, and Mal. And there's a little boy called Watt, who is a rather uneducated, simple-minded boy who tends to hang out with Mal because she's nice to him and everybody else kicks him the whole time. So Mal and Watt are these marginal figures. And then into this scene, we have this mysterious man they did not know who shows up. He's also referred to as the stranger. And he prompts various different reactions. So listen. They were winnowing in the big garner, the last of the wheat which the Prioress looked to sell at a good price at Grinton. Because of the dust, it was very thirsty work, and long before noon the bailiff winked his eye to one of the men and walked away towards the kitchen. The rest of them followed soon, keeping close to the wall and out of sight of the windows, in case the Prioress was looking out. Mal trailed after them, last of all. Cook already had his face behind a can of ale, and a man they did not know sat with him, black, shaggy-haired, in patched leather hosen, a man of not much more than 30 by his look, but with lines bitten into his face by hunger or sorrow, or by some stress beyond the common lot. Yet when those who came in from the winnowing grew merry over their ale, he was laughing with them, and more than once it was a shrewd saying of his or a homely, salty story that had set them laughing. Certainly, for all the raggedness and wretchedness of his look, he was one of those that have a way with them. Even the bailiff listened when he spoke, and Cook, a man of uneasy temper, treated him with unusual sweetness, so that the drinking time in the kitchen lasted longer than anyone had thought for. But at last they must go back to their work, so by ones and twos they drifted away. Mal had not come into the kitchen. She had stood all the time at the door, gaping in. Now they had to shoulder past her, so stupid she was, and so taken up with staring goggle-eyed at the stranger. Only when all had gone except Cook and him, and he got up and came towards the door, she skipped back out of the way, standing aside in the shadowed passage till he had bidden, "God be with you," to the cook and gone out. Then she followed him. There was no one in the great court to bid mad Mal back to work, but the Prioress herself saw her, for she stood at her window with Dame Anne Ladyman. First they saw the stranger come out. "There goes an ugly vagabond knave," said the Prioress. "Whence is he?" Dame Anne agreed that surely he was a rough one to look at. She supposed he might be Sir Ralph's new shepherd's man from over towards Loonsdale, where folk are very poor and wild. When Mal went by following after him, it was Dame Anne who said with a titter, "See the fool running after him." The Prioress tushed, impatient of Dame Anne's meaning, and for that reason would not open the window to send the woman back to the winnowing. Also, her thought was more taken up by the man. "Fie," said she, the Prioress, "if Sir Ralph hath brought that one into the dale, he hath brought a very stout rogue. See how he goes." He passed just then under the lintel of the gatehouse, and something in the way he carried himself made it seem, though it was amply high, too low and mean for him to pass beneath. "Fie," she said again, feeling herself strangely and strongly moved against the fellow. "I warrant this is one of those whose humour it is to grudge at rich men, and would pull all down to be as wretched as they." When the man came out from the Priory gate, there was Wat, Gibdor's brat, sitting by the nun's duck pond, hugging his knees. He got up at once and came slinking down to the laneway as the man went past the churchyard towards the nuns' steps. He came alongside Mal and gave her a quick, glinting look, a strange look, but neither frightened nor wary nor wicked. His face was slobbered with tears, but that didn't matter, for she was crying too. They smiled at each other, and when she held out her hand, he took it. So they both went together after the man. By now he had come nearly to the gate in the wall that divided the priory land just here from the Bulmers. He went slowly with his head bent as though he marked the young grass growing, for it was a very fair, bright day, and for the first time the grass smelt of spring. After him, but some way behind, came Mal and Wat, the brown ducks that had been preening and scratching and shaking themselves with much fuss and flutter on the edge of the pond, went now in line, following him towards the gate, and a few of the priory sheep, which the shepherd had brought down from Owlands, moved that way too, slowly, with little pauses and starts. When the man had gone through the gate, letting the weight swing it to after him, he turned for a moment and looked at them all. They stood still, nor did any of those creatures move again until he went on, more quickly now, up the nuns' steps and into the wood. Only then they came to the gate, and Mal and Wat stood looking over it and watching him as he went. The ducks gathered about their feet, and the sheep too, in a little crowd, and looked between the pales. The sun, not yet very high, struck right in among the bare trees, finding out the bright watery green of the trunks, and unlocking all the distances. The wind, moving strongly through the wood, filled it with sliding shadows, as if the air bore light upon its back, as a running river bears ripples. So he went up and out of sight, under the great branches that bowed and swung, while the little twigs seemed to clap themselves together for joy. A cloud covered the sun. He had gone, and Mal and Wat came back to the bare hillside among the boulders, where now the wind brought only chill. But for Mal it was golden harvest weather. The ears of corn were full, wrought foursquare, firm as a rope, exact as goldsmith's work. Like rope ends, they struck her thighs as she moved through them, loaded with goodness. She plumped down on the ground and caught Wat by his knees, so that he tumbled against her. Then they sat together, rocking to and fro, and Mal kept on babbling. We shall brast, Wat. We shall brast, we shall burst, while Wat made shocking faces and groaned in his throat. It hurt them so, the joy that was far too big for them, and the dread for God that was too great to be holden even of everywhere and forever, had bound himself into the narrow room of here and now. He that was in all things had for pity prisoned himself in flesh and in simple bread. He that thought winds, waters, and stars had made of himself a dying man. But at last, as if it were a great head of water that had poured itself with noise and splashing, and white foam leaping into a pool, and now rising higher covered its own inflow and so ran silent, though no less strong. Now they were lifted up and borne lightly as a fisherman's floats, and as stilly. They crouched on the hillside, looking towards God, feeling God under their spread palms on the grass, and through the soles of their feet. Beyond, 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 and beyond again, yet always that which went still beyond, God. And here, with only a low wooden gate between, that thing which man could never of himself have thought, and would never come to the depth of for all his thinking, here that thing impossible was true as daylight. Here was God in man, here all in a point. I realize it's already 1 minute past 11. If you need to go, go in peace and have a blessed Sunday. If you want to wait, maybe just look over this for 3 or 4 minutes. And if anybody wants to stay and share any quick reflections, I'll be very happy to stay and talk as long as anyone wishes to. So let's just keep a few minutes of quiet. I'll break the silence in a few minutes.
And if you do want